Salutations from space and aloha from Earth, friends. This is Gemini Brett, and we're here to talk about time. Maybe twice. Mercury's retrograde. I'm not sure when recordings just started, so you might have seen that twice. Like sands through the hourglass, these are the days of our lives. We are students of space and time, and I think looking into space-time, looking at the way that time is described astronomically, opens wide windows of correspondences and what we can find astrologically. So one of the master classes I kind of bring my students through is creating a luminary calendar. And I'm going to show some elements of it today. In fact, we're going to make this part one, because I really want to take some time with this. So today we'll focus mostly on sun time or Earth sun time. All right, the luminary calendar aligning time with the cycles of light. So first of all, why? Right? Like, why not just do this thing that we're all doing? Right? This Gregorian calendar with its strange months of 31 and others of 30 or 28, sometimes 29. Like, where does that all come from? Well, it seems out of whack, right? I mean, this kind of unharmonic time, what does it pace to? And we look at these things like September. Sep means 7, but it's the 9th month of the year. And October, Oc means 8, 10th month of the year. The 11th month of the year, Nov is 9. And Dec is 10, but December is the 12th month of the year. Why? And this brings us to the calendar's creator, Julius Caesar, who threw in these months of July and August, in Leo time, because this is a Northern Hemisphere thing, and gave the hot months to the Caesars, right? July named for Julius Caesar and August for Augustus Caesar. So the Julian calendar was created in the 1st century BC. And it uses a value of 365 and 1/4 days per year, which is almost right. It's almost right, but not quite. And so after many centuries, it was realized that this 365 and 1/4 day per year calendar was not keeping time. One of the big deals was that Easter was slipping from the equinox. So Emperor Sixtus V, right, organized the scholars and edited the Julian calendar into the Gregorian calendar that is used by most of the world and most people today. Sixtus V. I mean, interestingly, this was a huge gift for astrology because nobody could really understand why the Julian calendar wasn't working. And the answer, for those of us who now, and they did then, have decimals, is that the year is not actually 365.25 days long, but rather 365.2422. And even that's an average. And that small difference in that fraction of days was making a huge difference over years and years and decades, and especially centuries and centuries. So the Gregorian calendar was first instituted in the 16th century, but not everybody was hip to that, right? To the Pope's calendar. But I'll just say importantly, when we are existing by Gregorian time, right? So I began today at 4:30 p.m. on Thursday, February 4th, 2021, right? Like, where does that come from? and why do we agree to it, right? Because very much like at the maybe the very matrix or construct of our consciousness is time, is language, is number, and how we use it. And these aren't things that we typically consider. We are living by a calendar that is clearly inharmonic. 31, 28, 31, 30, 31, 30, 31, 31, 30, etc. That's not tuned to the light of the moon, which of course is where the word month comes from. But we're doing an annual or a yearly calendar, right? Is that a bad thing? No, not at all. Not if you like things like food, right? And I'm actually going to stop this and just rap with you for a bit. I decided to break this into 2 sessions so I could take some more time and kind of show you some of the astronomy of these things. So one thing that really frustrates me is when people tell me that time is just this human construct, right? And that, you'll hear these things from the New Age, like you can't ascend to the 5th dimension if you're tripping on time, right? Well, New Agers age too, because they are here in 3 dimensions, or maybe 4, where the 4th dimension is time itself, right? So space is a 3-dimensional thing in this experience, and time would be that 4th dimension, like how we move through space. And, it is very much astronomically derived. So why we have 12 months in a year, and we'll find that astronomically. What is a year itself? This is an astronomical thing. Why are there 365 and about a quarter days in a year? This is an astronomical thing too. And in the sense that astrology is the truth that astronomical cycles influence our energetic experience as earthlings. And I'll say astrology is much more than that, but that's a very simple, kind of real world description of astrology, right? Astronomical cycles influence our energetic experience as earthlings. Well, what is cycles? Time. So it's interesting to me when I hear astrologers, especially, say that time is a construct. It's like, well, why are you following the sun and the moon? Why are you following the planetary engagements, etc.? Because here we are on Earth, and Earth spins, and Earth orbits, right? We experience time, and really dropping into the construct of time, the astronomical basis of time, and also, what is defined astronomically and what might be more arbitrary. And why? Right? Why do we have 60 minutes in an hour? Why do we have 24 hours in a day, or 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night? At least if you use hours that are able to flex. So, right, the old system, the planetary hour system, is regardless of whether you're living where I am right now in the Northern Hemisphere in February, where nights are longer than day, or you're in the Southern Hemisphere where days are longer than night. We give 12 hours to each, and therefore day and night hours are of a different length, right? That's not what we do now with, civil hours, 60-minute hours, 60-second minutes, right? There's this very kind of structured version of time that we're doing. And yet we still then have this calendar with 31 days, 28, sometimes 29, 31, 30, 31, that whole trip, which just seems strange. Where does that come from? Is the hour itself arbitrary? Are seconds arbitrary? Perhaps, right? Maybe we could say there's 30 hours in a day and work on some different math. But a day is very clearly astronomically defined, and the year is too. And what about the month? or the moonth. Well, there's many opinions of what that may be. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2. Have you spent time considering that our experience is so incredibly linked to our language? Right? I mean, it's hard to move about life without narrating what you're experiencing. Or are you actually experiencing what you're narrating? So the way that we use our words, our language is very important, right? So spells. Number as well. So many believe that number is some construct of the human intellect. But Pythagoras let us know that all is number. Number is nature. And I don't think we often stop to consider how our consideration of number is very much creating our experience of the world. So a calendar is another very significant part of this. I mean, if we're going to meet live and do a presentation or have a consultation or meet for any kind of meeting, yeah, we need to agree on some kind of time. We need to be able to say things like February 4th, 2021 at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, or translate that to universal time or whatever it may be. I mean, we need to have a universal time if we want to participate with one another, especially as a global collective, right? And we used to celebrate a much more localized version of time. I'll speak more about that when I get back into these slides. But as soon as our reach started extending, right, as soon as we could take a train from here to there, or even more, get there much faster with like the telegraph, right? We needed some way to agree on, California time and time in Melbourne, Australia. Very different things, One's in the almost sunset and others in the morning and all that. But tuning into local time, and really, one of my favorite things to teach is how to just create a simple sundial, or how to actually even realize first and foremost, you are a simple sundial when you stand up straight, and what your shadow is doing throughout the course of the day. And also the midday shadow throughout the course of the year has so much to say. How to create, the ancient clock really can help us tune into time. And some things that I think we often take for granted in the astrological chart, and some things that I find really confuse folks, like, why the primary motion through the houses is 12, 11, 10, 9, where the other motion goes 1, 2, 3, or Aries, Taurus, Gemini, or whatever it may be. And the sundial has so much healing to offer to any confusion around time. So yeah, we need to agree on some kind of calendar. And I think astrologers have this agreement, right? I could say that today is the waning moon of the Capricorn month. So I'm speaking tropical zodiac here, right? Though the sun is now in the tropical sign of Aquarius, our last new moon was in the sign of Capricorn. That would be a decent definition of when a month begins. And we're about 3 weeks into it, right? The waning half moon. I mean, I could be more specific. I could say, hey, let's meet online. I'll just say right now, when the moon is at 2020 Scorpio reflecting Aquarius light, right? So if you can cast a chart, which we can quickly in this day of computers, we could all find that is very beautifully described, as well as 4:48 p.m. Pacific is. And I think as astrologers, we're really bringing ourselves to more natural time, which is the first part of the thing and most of it, right? So when we align ourselves to new moons and full moons, when we align ourselves to the Jupiter Saturn conjunctions that come around every 200 years and move through the elements in about 200, and all the things that we've been studying lately, when we align ourselves to the Saturn Uranus conjunctions and how they move through time, and now of course we're coming into the equivalent of a waning moon in that cycle, right? We are realigning ourselves to light time. And yet we'll say, and let's gather on February 4th, 2021 at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, or do your own time conversion for your time zone. What would it take for us to change the shape of how we are communicating time, and kind of breaking away from this calendar, which was created by the emperor and redesigned by the Pope, right? And if that's your crew, that's your calendar. But I'll kind of say that's not my crew. I'd like to be less empire oriented personally. I'd like to be less religion oriented personally. And I imagine that's true for many of people tuning in right now. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this in the comments, by the way. And since we are an astrological community, and since time literally is, like astrology, described astronomically, perhaps we should find a more elegant astronomical calendar to work with. I mean, I can say, I'll hit the now button on my software once again, that the sun is currently at 16 degrees and 25 arc minutes of Aquarius. And the sun won't be right there for long. I could get more specific here, and I could say that the sun is at 16 degrees, 25 minutes, and 51 arc seconds of the tropical sign we call Aquarius. And that defines a moment in time, which won't happen again until, well, what we currently call 2022. Why? Religion. I mean, a lot of people prefer to say things like BCE, right? And so before Common Era and Common Era instead of BC and AD, which of course are Latin terms that many English folks speak as before Christ and after death, right? It's not exactly what they mean, but of course, yeah, the 1 year is supposedly tuned to the time of Christ. And so we're working with, and very globally, this, Vatican defined time based upon the Julian calendar, which came from an emperor and then was later reconfigured by a pope. And I didn't finish just saying this before, but a cool thing there was we really couldn't figure out why the calendar wasn't working. And they had to dust off a lot of old astrological texts because this had already been figured out. I mean, certainly the Hebrew calendar, which way predates the Julian calendar, understood how long the year was and how long it takes for the moon year and the sun year, which I'll be speaking more about in part 2, to synchronize to the Chinese calendar as well. And we're just coming into Chinese New Year time. But a lot of that was pushed aside by a new religion and by a new empire. And it had to get dusted off. It had to get remembered and reintegrated. This very much led to a renaissance of astrology because a lot of the old information was coming back around. And there's some beautiful astronomical devices in many of the old churches where we can see light beams playing throughout the course of the day and throughout the course of the year, you know, walking rose lines, which are embraced with the astrological signs, you know. I mean, one of my favorite things to show religious folks, like I've been, you know, accused by Catholics, for example, of practicing the devil's, you know, magic, astrology. It's like, oh, well, did you know that at St. Peter's Square at the Vatican, there is an Egyptian obelisk that was, you know, borrowed from Egypt. I put a little nifty cross on top to make it Christian. And it's used as a sundial, but it's also used as a meridian calendar to track the year by looking at the shadow of an Egyptian obelisk moving across a line embraced by the signs of the tropical zodiac. So what's that? I love showing that to people because it's, you know, undeniable, something you can touch. Maybe at some point it will get eradicated as people are attacking astrology more and more. But the thing is, if we study time and we're the keepers of time, this knowledge can't go away. And if ever it does, it will have to be reclaimed to help us understand, I mean, even how to plant and harvest. Okay. So one invitation here is, let's find a way to create together a calendar that honors the earth and the sun and the moon and the harmony of the heavenly spheres, that's not created by some empire or some religion that maybe you don't belong to or don't want to. Let's create an astronomical, let's create an astrological calendar. And in a sense, our charts are doing that, right? I mean, again, I can say the sun is just about to move to 16 tropical Aquarius. That happens every year. I can look at where the moon is and what the moon's doing with the sun. And so as I'm tuning into charts, I really am tuning into astrological time. But what if we could together create a community calendar that we could actually replace the Gregorian calendar with, at least when we meet in the guild, right? Like as our community, as our collective. All right. So let's go back to this strange map, right? January, named for Janus, right? The two-headed god. And this is a cool thing, right? One's looking back to the year past and one ahead to the year to come. We see that honored in much of the modern iconography, though it's out of focus. You know, where you get this Father Time who looks a lot like some versions of Santa, and the Saturnian sickle, right? And then the baby brought in by the stork, you know, the dying year and the year that is just born. So clock time. What is this? Why do we have minutes and hours? Why 24 hours in a day? Or maybe more importantly, what is a day? So in this idea that astrology, at least in part, is the truth that astronomical cycles influence our energetic experience as earthlings, what could be more of a supportive statement for that than the truth that we experience day and night? I mean, they're so absolutely different. You only have to live 24 hours time to experience this profound shift in yin and yang. And this, of course, is because Earth spins on her axis in one day, bringing us such hits as sunrise and sunset. But really, that is a motion of Earth, who spins from the west to the east. So we see the sky here on Earth spinning from the east to the west. In the northern hemisphere, that experience is centered around Polaris, pole star, north star. In the southern hemisphere, right, there's this center of rotation that is visible too. No star there in our day and age. This is an old image, a petroglyph from Chaco Canyon in New Mexico in the United States, where, like many others, I feel they were describing this primary motion, as it's called. The first motion of Earth is Earth's daily rotation, right? And even though, again, that brings us such hits as sunrise and sunset, it's a motion that's all about the Earth. And of course, now we say that's happening in 24 hours time. You could describe that in any way, but regardless of how you divide it, it is a day. And it is a very astronomical thing. Agreed? So rotation, day is rotation. How do we experience day here on Earth? And when should a day begin? Interestingly, in our day and age, we tend to begin our calendar days in the middle of the night. What a trip, right? I mean, this is when the sun is as far below ground as possible, halfway between sunset and sunrise. And that used to be midnight, and it is still midnight. It's the middle of the night, but it's not necessarily clock midnight. All right. So if we look at this at equinox time, it's going to be about 6 hours after middle of the night that we experience sunrise. Wouldn't that be a more accurate idea of the beginning of a day? Doesn't that seem natural to you? So why would we begin our days in the middle of the night? I think that's a really important question for us to ask. Because let's say we agreed to create a new calendar. All right, well, we have some very specific units of time that are just defined by nature, and one is day. Again, how we want to divide the day. Should we do this thing of 24 hours and 60 minutes and an hour and 60 seconds and a minute and all of that? That's a good question. But a day is a day. It's one spin of the Earth in relations to the sun. That's called the tropical day. So we could say that's midnight to midnight. But how do you know it's midnight if you don't have a clock? We could say it's sunrise to sunrise. Might be easier to define. We could say it's midday to midday. Well, how do you know midday? And there's actually, if you put a stick in the ground, there's a very clear answer to this. It's the shortest shadow of the day because the midday sun is at its highest height. And the higher the sun, the shorter the shadow, right? Importantly, that midday sun, which is the sun at the midheaven, in the northern hemisphere, that's the sun at the midheaven due south. So the shortest shadow of the day in the northern hemisphere is pointing due north. The opposite is true in the southern hemisphere. The midday sun is in the northern sky due north, and so the shadow points due south. So if you measure the shadow of a stick throughout the course of a day, and you just understand that that shortest one you measured is pointing on your meridian, on your north-south line, you can very easily draw a line in the sand, keep the stick in place, and every time that shadow is pointing on the line, it is the middle of the day. It's midday. I should just say also, and in fact, I created this animation in Stellarium for Ecuador, for Quito, very close to the equator, at equinox time, where the sun is actually directly above and there's no shadows. So if you're between the tropics, this midday sun due south or due north does not always apply for northern and southern hemisphere respectively. It can do both, and that's a long story for another time. But either way, I mean, you can see where the movement of the clock comes from, right? And importantly, this is the northern hemisphere experience, where when we're looking south at the midday sun, east is on the left and west is on the right. And so the sunwise motion, which many have called this primary motion, our experience of the rising and reaching and resting and rooting of the light because of Earth's daily rotation, in the northern hemisphere, at least always north of the Tropic of Cancer, that sunwise motion is a clockwise motion. This is why the clocks do this, because not only does the sun move like the hands of a clock through the sky, through the northern hemisphere sky, but also so does the shadow of a stick. If you put a stick in the ground or stand tall and be that stick, be that sundial. So maybe we should begin days in the middle of the day. I mean, that certainly contradicted itself, that language right then, right? But maybe at midday, maybe it's the height of the light, which is something that we could actually measure without clocks and computers and all that. That's always where I want to start these things. Like, how would we do it if the, solar blast like took away our computers and all? How can we return to natural time? And the tricky thing is, well, there's a lot of tricks to it. All right. So anyway, day. Maybe we should begin our days at sunset. That seems weird. Isn't sunset the end of the day? Well, it is if the day begins at sunrise. Or is it? Because right there you see two different definitions of what a day is. Right? Is the day actually the time of light from sunrise to sunset? Or is a day one rotation of the earth, 24 hours as we do it now, which would be sunrise to sunrise, or sun reach, midday to sun reach, or sun rest, right? Sunset to sun rest, or midnight to midnight. This is the one we're doing now. I mean, on some senses, it's cool because we're looking at the beginning of a day. It's around the time, and locally it should be the midnight when the sun begins its daily climb, right? So we get evidence of that at sunrise, but the climb begins when the sun is at the IC, the Imoncelli, the bottom of the heavens. And that's kind of cool, right? But again, if we didn't have computers or tick-tock clocks on the wall and wind-up gears and all that, how do you know when it's the middle of the night? So it seems like sunrise or midday, the shortest shadow, or sunset is a better idea. And of those three, sunrise certainly feels much more like a beginning. But we'll see, at least in part 2 and at the end of today's transmission, one calendar that begins its days at sunset. Why? So the daily rotation and the yearly revolution, that's the primary and secondary motions of Earth, as they're described by astronomers and astrologers alike. We once used to be the same thing. Importantly, Earth's axis of rotation, which I like to call Gaia's spine, which defines the directions, North Pole, South Pole, not the magnetic directions, true north, true south. That's just the spin axis of the Earth. That axis is tilted in respect to our orbital plane, which I know you astrologers know as the ecliptic, right? The plane of the Earth-Sun relationship, the year plane, right? Now, Earth will always remain pointing north and south, right? That, like, the axis isn't pointing at the sun every day of the year. It only points at the sun one day of the year, and it depends on which hemisphere you're on for that to be true. And it doesn't really point at the sun anyway, it leans towards the sun. But that's a very important thing because it gives us an experience of the year, of this annual motion, where the Earth is spinning 365 and about a quarter times as we orbit the Earth. It gives us an experience of the seasons. It helps us naturally divide that time. And importantly, since it is defined directionally, each day here, and each, therefore, astrological sign or degree of an astrological sign can be directionally defined. So let me give an example. I'll stop here, kind of in the middle of Taurus. right? And so what I'm showing here is that when the Earth has moved from March equinox, right, the beginning of tropical Aries, or our experience of the sun in Aries, and we're over here now, we're seeing the sun against the backdrop, not of the constellation, but of the sign Taurus, right? What are the difference between the two? Check out the last movie I did for EA Zoom, which was called The Sun on the Cross. You can find that easily on YouTube, but you can also find it at geminibrett.com. There's an offering page with a lot of videos. Many of them actually I first recorded for EA Zoom meetings, which often gives me an opportunity to kind of collect thoughts and put them on the page. And a lot of these slides are from the astronomy courses I teach for OPA. I'll be teaching for Astrology Hub this year. I'll be teaching for Kepler College this year. I really work hard to try to animate these things, which of course are not to scale, but I like to show moving cycles with moving image. Yeah. Okay. So because the pole is always leaning north, there's a couple ways that we can see this moment in time, which I'll call the sun at 15 degrees tropical Taurus. So one is just how the shadow play is going, which will determine the lengths of day and night for all the different places on Earth. And another literally is directional in regards to the north-south, which is defined by Earth's axis of rotation. So this angle between north and where the sun is in regards to the center of Earth changes daily and repeats annually, right? This is the yearly thing. And I've proven time and again that the tropical zodiac, while we call it seasonal, we have a challenge to face there because, of course, there's seasonal opposition between the hemispheres, but it is very much directional. So whether in the middle of Taurus, you're in Northern Hemisphere spring or Southern Hemisphere fall, right? More light in the Northern Hemisphere than in the Southern Hemisphere at this time. This is still the sun literally northeast from Earth's center. So the directionality of the tropical zodiac, that works for both hemispheres. Here we are at June solstice, where the northern axis of Earth's daily rotation or rotational motion is leaning towards the sun. And that means summer solstice for the northern hemisphere, winter solstice for the southern hemisphere. As I like to call it north solstice, which speaks for both, or June solstice, which speaks for both. So there's many experiences we have of this. You'll see this is cast for Pisa, Italy, in the year 1564, because I use Galileo for an example often in my astronomy classes, because I like working with astronomers who are also astrologers. Anyway, this would be like the first summer solstice for Galileo, because of course, June solstice is summer solstice in Italy, Northern Hemisphere, and this is the highest midday sun of the year. Here I'm looking at clock noon because it's a lot easier to do in the software rather than the sun at the midheaven. But basically, even around this time of clock noon, when I took the daylight savings away, we're pretty close to the sun at the midheaven. And I just want you to see, and this for me is what the Gemini glyph is all about. For 6 months, the sun comes down, and you can see the months with the moon coming by for new moon, new moon. And for 6 months, the sun goes back up. Right? Do you see the Gemini glyph there? If you put a stick in the ground and you track its shadow at midday, in Italy, the midday shadow will always be the shortest shadow of the day and will always point due north. But the winter solstice midday shadow, where the sun is midday low as possible, will be the longest midday shadow. And then the summer solstice sun is the shortest midday shadow. So you can literally track time with shadows on that meridian line, which is how that obelisk at the Vatican that I was describing before works, and how many of these great solar calendars that have been placed around the world. So this is one of our experiences, of course, of the seasons due to Earth's tilt, right? Another way we experience this is in the truth that that sun rises at a different place on the eastern horizon every day and sets at a different place on the western horizon every day. In the northern hemisphere, spring and summer, and this, of course, is the sun moving through Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo. Those are the northern signs. And so whether you're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, these are times when the sun is rising north of east and setting north of west. And of course, at June solstice, it's most north. And then the sun stops and turns around, which for me is this Cancer glyph. Sun moves 6 months in one direction. Solstice means the sun stops what? Moving south until December solstice, the furthest southern rise and set of the sun. And then the sun then moves north for 6 months and stops and turns around at the tropicos, which means turns around. So let's just watch this. This is like a year of sunrise, sunrise, sunrise. There's equinox. Here's the June solstice, the northernmost sunrise, back to autumnal equinox, due east, and then December solstice. And so this is a cool thing. So for December solstice, of course, that means winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, summer solstice in the southern hemisphere. But regardless, it is the south solstice. It is the time when the sun is both rising as far south on the eastern horizon and setting as far west on the western horizon. Sorry, setting as far south on the western horizon as possible. And in the northern hemisphere, that means short days. And in the southern hemisphere, that means long days. So these are things that we can track. And we don't need computers and clocks to do this. We just need eyes and time. So here I'm stopping with the Earth east of the sun west of the center of Earth, all described by Earth's now north-south axis, right? So that defines the directions. So at September equinox, when the sun ingresses Libra, the sun is literally due west of Earth, not, you know, Tokyo and England. Those have different west, but I'm talking about the center of Earth where we are all connected. And this, I'm sure, is why the Libra glyph is the setting sun, because that is the image of west. And by the way, I'll be doing a talk in March about the glyphs, the tropical astronomy of the sign glyphs. They all teach astronomy, and that's with ESAR. So check that out at their website, please. Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, right? This brings us to December solstice, where now it's the southern side of Earth's lean that's pointing or leaning towards the sun. So northern hemisphere, winter solstice, southern hemisphere, summer solstice, more light, right? And that would be a reasonable time to begin the year. Oh, here's one of these glyphs, by the way. Sagittarius shows us the primary motion tilted in respect to the secondary motion, day and year. When the southern lean is towards the sun, when the southern axis lean towards the sun, I'm having a hard time with my language today. This is December solstice. And I love showing this image because the truth is that means that the sun is shining directly above the Tropic of Capricorn, 23.5 degrees south of the Earth's equator. That's equal to Earth's tilt. So when the sun ingresses tropical Capricorn, it's shining directly overhead the Tropic of Capricorn. That's not a coincidence. And I'm just going to leave that alone for now. I will say that for me, that this is, I like to use this older Capricorn glyph because it seems to suggest the sun moving from its most southern place for overhead on the Earth, which is the Tropic of Capricorn, and then coming up to the equator once again at equinox time. And that, of course, is the sun moving here. But why do I stop? Because for some reason, we're not doing New Year's at one of these astronomically defined things. It really frustrates me. Like, when is New Year's? So people will say, oh, it's the middle of the night, midnight, actually clock midnight, which isn't the middle of the night, but it's close. So it's clock midnight. Okay, where? Oh, Greenwich Meridian, probably. Really? That's like where the middle of time happens if you studied it. You know, I mean, I used to always stay up for, count it down for the New Year's. And then as I've aged a bit, it's like, oh, why don't we just watch the ball drop in New York City? Because I've been living on the West Coast. I'm like, that's like 9 p.m. for me. It's a little easier, you know? But it's frustrating to me that we are using a time and date that is not astronomically derived. December solstice or south solstice, that's the same moment of time everywhere on Earth. That is an Earth sun thing. And the Earth sun thing is what describes the year, right? Earth aligning with the sun. So why not use a solstice or an equinox? And if so, which one? Like, why do this thing that really has no astronomical basis? Such a trip to me. Many astrologers begin the year here, right, with the sun's Aries ingress. And I think there's good reason for this. It's very much an astronomical thing. Why? Because at this time, from Earth's point of view, from the center of the Earth, where all Earthlings are connected, the sun is due east. And all we have to do is watch a sunrise to know that east is the energy of new beginnings. I'm going to show the same thing to you from a different perspective, from a geocentric perspective. This is the very real astronomy of the tropical zodiac. So we'll start with this primary motion, Earth's daily rotation, right? The celestial equator, Earth's equator projected into space is the plane of that rotation. And I like to call it the circle of matter, because though this motion brings us such hits as sunrise and sunset, it's really, again, all about the Earth. The Earth-Sun plane would be the ecliptic plane, the plane of our secondary motion, the plane of Earth's orbit about the sun, or from Earth's point of view, the plane of the sun's yearly motion about us through the stars, the constellations, and the signs of the zodiac. So I like to call this the circle of spirit because it's where the sun lives. So we were looking at this from a heliocentric or sun-centered model before, and now geocentric or earth-centered. These two planes, the plane of the day, celestial equator, and the plane of the year, ecliptic, diverge by 23.5 degrees. That's the tilt angle of Earth. And so from the time of March equinox, sun's ingress 0 degrees tropical Aries, to solstice, the sun is gaining in northern declination. So we'll take a look at that. Importantly, the solstice points are where these planes most diverge, and the equinox points are where they cross. People give a hard time to tropical astrologers. They say your signs are wrong. They're not aligned to the constellations. Our zodiac is not constellational, and it's not meant to be. It is about this. This is the very real astronomy of the tropical zodiac. And it's something I teach often in many different presentations because I think it's so important for people to see how the equator on Earth and the tropics reflect these two planes of day and year, respectively. How we divide these very 4 real astronomical points of equinox and solstices into 12 signs, that's kind of a different tale, and maybe a tale for another time or next time perhaps. But for now, I want to kind of tune you into the solar serpent, the year snake. And this we can see, in our tables by tracking declination. Because when the sun is at the celestial equator, where we measure declination from, its declination is 0. And as we move Aries, Taurus, Gemini, we get to our furthest north declination, furthest north of the celestial equator. And that is the definition of 0 degrees tropical Cancer. And interestingly, when the sun ingresses Cancer, it's shining directly overhead the Tropic of Cancer on Earth. Not interestingly, like by definition. All right. And so this is, you can see here in the snaking graph, right, that 0 Cancer is the most northern declination of the sun during the course of the year. The sun's now going to come down from that northern peak. Cancer, Leo, and Virgo are northern signs that come south, back to the sun crossing the celestial equator, the equinox, when the sun is due west of the center of Earth. And now we're going into southern signs. Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, south going south to the southernmost point, right? And this is where you could say, I mean, if you do north is up, which maybe we can do, not, it's not just a northern hemisphere thing, but the Earth is literally moving north through space, okay? So this we could then say is when the goat starts to climb the mountain. Of course, that's the northern hemisphere experience of the midday sun in the sky too, right? December solstice being our winter solstice, our lowest midday sun in the northern hemisphere. So now we climb back up. So Cancer, Aquarius, Pisces brings us to the equator. This is the time when the sun on the ecliptic, always on the ecliptic, one of the 2 times a year where the sun is on the cross of the day plane and the year plane, right? And this was kind of the focus of my sun on the cross talk for EA Zoom videos, where I'm talking about the turning of the ages and the galactic alignment of our day and age. I hope you'll check out that movie. But here, just understand that, like, this is for me why Easter happens at this time, and also why Passover happens at this time. The sun on the ecliptic, always on the ecliptic, is literally passing over the celestial equator. This is where the year plane passes over the day plane from south to north. And yeah, you know, many will say that, well, this is the beginning of the astrological year, but it's because when light overcomes night, days begin growing longer than the nights. Well, that's a northern hemisphere thing. But what I can say for sure is that this is when the sun is east of the entire globe, something, you know, the center, which we all share. If you know the story of Passover, right, these houses were passed over by the, you know, angels of death in the middle of the night, the houses that had ram's blood painted on above the door. Well, this is the door, okay, passing over, sun passing over the equator. And why ram's blood? Because this is the sun ingressing tropical Aries. And I hope I showed you in the Cancer glyph, this is the yearly sun walking on the horizons, the Gemini glyph, the sun going up and down, the Libra glyph, the setting sun when the sun is due west, the Capricorn glyph, sun climbing from its southern extreme at the Tropic of Capricorn up to the equator. Well, what is the Aries glyph? If you watch the eastern sky, especially close to the equator, which is where I created this animation in Stellarium software from, notice the movement of the stars. Stars that rise south of east head to the south, and those that rise north of east head to the north. And every day, forever and ever, the eastern sky describes the motion of the Aries glyph. And like the horns of the ram, it hooks back around to set in the west. I'm sure this is why we assigned the eastern sign with the ram, the ram's horn. That goes way back to Egypt. Easter, right? The sun on the cross, somehow now associated with bunnies and eggs, which certainly seems to carry forth some of the old quote unquote pagan rituals of fertility that come with Northern Hemisphere spring equinox time. Oester, which means the east. Well, just listen, Easter, right? The sun is on the cross, due east of the center of Earth. And this happened around Passover time. So when this is Easter in 2021, April 4th. Why am I showing a moon calendar? Because it has to do with the moon. But the way that Easter is done now, it kind of interestingly has to do with the month, right? So Earth, Moon, Sun. Also, the days of the week, it's got to be a Sunday, because, well, this is solar worship after all. So the day of the sun that follows the full moon, I've got to turn this back to March. The Sunday that follows the full moon, that follows March equinox. So a really cool thing here is that the March equinox is Earth Sun, right? That's the year. The Sunday is these magical planetary days of the week, which have been around for a long time, right? So the day of the sun after the full moon, Earth, Moon, Sun, after March equinox, Earth, Sun. Pretty cool. Incredibly astronomical. And still, that fourth, what's that have to do with the moon? What's it have to do with Earth, Sun? Why not just do it at a new moon or a full moon time and at the equinox or at the solstice? What time is this? From where? Right? So astronomical time says use an equinox or solstice because equinox happens everywhere on Earth at the same time. It's an Earth-Sun thing. Passover this year of 2021 will run to April 4th from this full moon, the full moon near the March equinox, which is not Jewish New Year, right? That's on the other side of the year, and what I'll call the sunset of the year. And we'll be exploring that next time. For now, just to kind of close this part one, why do we have 12 signs? Why do we have 12 months? In our sister traditions like sacred geometry or sacred harmony, it's easier to see and hear that creation creates in 12s. Astronomically, this would be about the sun and the moon, the luminaries. And so this is why I'm talking about a luminary calendar. But really the sun and the moon and the earth. Because if we're tracking like new moon to new moon as a definition of a month, and there's many ways to define a month, well, we're seeing the moon aligned to the sun from Earth, right? It's an Earth, Moon, Sun thing. It's about, as I believe Hermes said in the tablets, the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. And we're going to talk about moons in part 2. For now, let's just talk about the solar year and the way that we're dividing this into 12 signs, right? So we take a 360-degree circle and we say from Earth's point of view, the sun's going to go from one point back to that point in 365 and about a quarter days. We don't divide the time into equal slices. We divide the travel into equal slices. Because despite this image, this is not happening on a circular path. And of course, as we know, our experience of sun moving about us, or let me say, of course, as modern astronomy suggests, perhaps you have your own opinion, perhaps you're of the Flat Earth Society or whatever you want to do, fine. We can't ignore the truth that the sun, from our point of view, is moving around the zodiac in 1 year, one tropical year, 365.2422 days about. And so we can look at that movement and divide it into 12 signs. So as much as I can say, all right, yeah, we are here in kind of week 4 is just beginning of the Capricorn moon, because here on what we call February 4th, 2021, the previous new moon was the Capricorn new moon. And now with today's waning half Scorpio moon reflecting Aquarius light, we are moving into the last week of the lunation, right? So that would be talking calendar with the luminaries, like, you know, with moon and sun. But we could also just say, oh, we're like 16 days into Aquarius. And therefore, if we chose to begin the year, let's say at December solstice, right, which would be the astronomical time closest to this January 1st, most of us are doing now. We are now at the cross quarter, right? We are now at the time when the sun is halfway between December solstice, 0 degrees Capricorn, and March equinox, 0 degrees Aries, right? We are now at that place where in space, the sun is halfway, not necessarily in time. And this is why, and thanks to Time and Date, a wonderful website for this illustration. Orbits are not circular, but rather elliptical. This is a very exaggerated eclipse of the Earth-Sun situation. You know, an interesting thing that is astronomical that aligns to early January is when every year the Earth is closest to the sun in our day and age. And that's going to happen for a long time. Around July 4th, the Earth is furthest from the sun and therefore literally moving slower. And so our experience of that is the sun moving slower through the zodiac. And therefore it takes longer for the sun to move through like Cancer and Leo than it does for the sun to move through tropical Sagittarius and Capricorn, right? Because we have perihelion around January 2nd to 4th, usually most years, depending on where we are in the leap thing. So certainly one way that we can just track luminary time and to get away from this thing, we're all doing. It's just watching the sun move through the signs. But how are we going to do that if we don't have a button to cast a chart? Okay, like how will you know if that ever goes down that the sun is at 15 degrees tropical Aquarius? And there are beautiful ways to know. And these are some of the things that I like to teach in my sacred astronomy courses, right? Like old gadgets and sitting with, like, I just watched the sunset. You probably experienced that in reverse. And it sets on a very specific part of the mountain that I can see from my window. And it won't set there again in this exact same way until 1 year from today. Well, that's a bit of a fib. It'll also set there when the sun is at 15 degrees Scorpio, which is called Antisha, tale for another time. So anyway, one way we can get off the Empire Pope calendar, we're doing it, right? Today is not February 4th. Today is 15 Aquarius. We can make this much more intricate by realigning where we choose to begin our years. And many astrologers are doing the sun's 0 Aries ingress, right? When the sun is due east from the center of Earth. Cool. Or maybe solstice makes sense. So the things I'll ask you just at the end of this is like, where do we want to begin our year? And where do we want to begin our day? Should we begin at sun roots, middle of the night, sunrise, sun reach, middle of the day, or sun rest for the day? And if so, like if you're beginning your year at sunrise, it probably makes sense for you to begin the year at your spring equinox. That's like the sunrise of the year. But that's different for northern and southern hemispheres. And it would be nice to think globally and act locally. We can create a system that's global and then also is reconfigured for wherever you are on the earth. In part 2, we're going to bring in the moon. Where should you begin your month? I mean, January 1st of 2021 had nothing to do with the moon. She was kind of full, but she was actually on the wane. New moon was on January 12th, 2021. Is that the beginning of the month? But what if we decide to begin with December solstice for the year? which was not a new moon or a full moon either, right? Like, how can you do both? How can you do both the solar calendar and a lunar calendar? That's what we're going to get into in part 2. Not an easy thing. And it takes 19 years for the years of gold and silver to synchronize. You know, we can look at calendars like the Chinese calendar, which will begin anew on February 12th. Why? Because it begins at the beginning of spring, which they do not define as spring equinox, but rather the cross quarter time. And that spring equinox would be the middle of this season, just like Shakespeare Midsummer Night's Dream is describing summer solstice, but he calls it midsummer. So learning, you know, and it's beautiful to have this opportunity to transmit this today on a cross quarter at Imbolc time, like learning your cross quarter sacred days, Beltane and Lammas or Lugnasa and Samhain and Imbolc, right? Helps us tune into some of these other great calendars that really have this thing figured out, that they are sun, earth, moon calendars. So the Hebrew calendar is another thing that we'll investigate. I mean, it goes way back into the Babylonian calendar, into the Assyrian calendar. And both of these solely lunar sun moon calendars, and the Chinese calendar, which is ancient, right, and the Hebrew, Babylonian, Assyrian calendar, these cats really cracked the code of how to do years based on the moon and also on the sun. So next time we're going to spend some time with why perhaps the Hebrew calendar celebrates New Year's around the autumn of the year. Northern Hemisphere autumnal equinox is like the sunset of the year. And why it makes sense, because if days begin with Diana's bow, well, that has to begin the day at sunset time, for that's when the moon is reborn each month. All right, so that's where we're going in part 2 of the luminary calendar, aligning time with the cycles of light. Thanks so much for tuning in. I want to say a couple more things, just that, you know, it's been said that the patriarchy took natural time and like a 13-month calendar and just destroyed it. Well, there's not 13 moons in a year. So be careful. Like, people are, I think, telling the introducing us to the problem, but then giving poor solutions. It's a pretty tricky thing. And next time we're going to have our calculators out a little bit. And, you know, to respect these old calendars, like before decimals, you know, like, it's amazing that these cats cracked the code. Like, amazing, amazing, amazing. You will see how challenging and elegant and intricate it is. We can say that, you know, we should get down with the moon. The moon waxes and wanes, describes the fortnights, shows us when there is a night light, you know, which matters less in our day and age of light pollution. But if you're away from the city lights, you know how much it means to be walking at night under a full moon versus a time when the moon is not around, aligned with the sun, you know. Planting intentions, planting seeds with new moon, or depending on the plant, sometimes full moon, right? Electing our experiences astrologically, and a lot of times elections will begin with the sun and the moon, right? Like, you know, the moon matters. But so should we choose a lunar calendar? Agriculture is assisted by working with the moon, but agriculture first and foremost is about the earth and the sun, about the season. So it might be best to plant broccoli at new moon, for example, but it doesn't matter if it's new or full moon in the middle of the summer. You're not getting broccoli. It's a winter plant. It's earth, sun, right? So please know, in this invitation to release the calendar of the Pope, I'm not saying we should release our awareness of the calendar of the year. And I'm certainly not saying we should not have a calendar of the month. I think we need to do them both. And that's the mystical code that together we will journey into in part 2. Thanks for tuning in, friends. I'll see you in space.
Thank you.